Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Washington, D.C. in the early 1970s was a city of contrasts, the nation's capital with its gleaming monuments and powerful institutions. Also harbored neighborhoods where ordinary families worked hard, raised their children, and dreamed of better futures. In these predominantly African-American communities, life moved with a familiar rhythm. Children walked to school, teenagers ran errands for their parents, and neighbors looked for one another. The spring of 1971 arrived with promise. Trees bloomed along the streets, days grew longer, and young people began spending more time outdoors. Families felt the cautious optimism that comes with seasonal change. Parents sent their children on simple errands, to the store, to a friend's house, to pick up groceries. These were normal, everyday activities in a community where people knew each other, where a trip to the local 7-Eleven was nothing to worry about. But something dark was awakening in the shadows of the nation's capital. On April 25, 1971, a 13-year-old girl left her home on a simple errand. She never returned. Her name was Carol Denise Spinks, and her disappearance would mark the beginning of a terror that would grip Washington, D.C. for the next 2 years. A nightmare that would claim at least 6 young lives and leave a community forever changed. This is the story of the Freeway Phantom. Carol Denise Spinks was everything a 13-year-old girl should be, full of life, curious about the world, and excited about her future. She lived with her family in the Congress Heights neighborhood of Southeast Washington, a working-class area where families took pride in their homes and their children. Carol was the kind of daughter every parent hoped to raise. She was responsible, trustworthy, and always willing to help around the house. She had warm brown eyes that lit up when she smiled, and a gentle demeanor that made adults trust her and other children want to be her friend. Carol was a 7th grader at Johnson Junior High School, where her teachers described her as a diligent student who turned in her homework on time and participated actively in class discussions. She wasn't the loudest girl in the room, but she had a quiet confidence that suggested she would grow into a remarkable young woman. Carol loved music. She would hum along to songs on the radio while doing her chores, her voice soft and melodic. She dreamed of finishing school, maybe going to college, though college seemed like a distant dream for many families in her neighborhood. But Carol's mother always told her that education was the key to a better life, and Carol believed her. She carried her books carefully, treated them with respect, and never complained about homework. Her family adored her. She had siblings who looked up to her, who saw her as responsible and caring. When her mother needed help with the younger children, Carol stepped up without being asked. When groceries needed to be carried, Carol volunteered. She was the kind of girl who made her parents' lives a little easier, who could be trusted to run to the store and come right back. On that Sunday evening in April, Carol's mother asked her to go to the store. It was a simple request: pick up a few items from the 7-Eleven on Wheeler Road, about 7 blocks from their home. Carol had made this trip dozens of times before. The route was familiar, the neighborhood was their own, and it was still light outside. There was no reason to worry. Carol grabbed some money, told her family she'd be right back, and walked out the door. She was wearing casual clothes, a light jacket, pants, comfortable shoes for the walk. She moved down the street with the easy confidence of a girl who knew her neighborhood, who had walked these sidewalks hundreds of times. The 7-Eleven was just 7 blocks away. 7 blocks that should have taken maybe 15 minutes to walk there and back. 7 blocks in her own neighborhood, where people knew her family, where she should have been safe. But Carol Denise Spinks never made it home. When Carol hadn't returned after an hour, her family began to worry. An hour might not seem like a long time, but for a simple errand to a nearby store, it was far too long. Her mother felt the first stirrings of unease, that maternal instinct that tells you something isn't right. She sent Carol's siblings to check the route to the store, to see if maybe Carol had stopped to talk to a friend, or if she'd been delayed somehow. They found nothing. No sign of Carol anywhere along the familiar path. By the time darkness fell, worry had turned to fear. Carol's mother contacted the police, reporting her daughter missing. The initial response was frustratingly familiar. Teenage girls sometimes run away, they said. Maybe she went to a friend's house. Maybe she'll turn up in the morning. The police took the report, but there was no sense of urgency, no immediate mobilization of resources. But Carol's mother knew her daughter. Carol wasn't the type to run away. Carol wasn't rebellious or troubled. Carol was responsible, dependable. and she would never willingly put her family through this kind of worry. Something had happened to her daughter, and with every passing hour, the fear grew more intense. The family spent a sleepless night hoping for Carol's return, praying they would hear her footsteps on the porch, her voice calling out that she was home. But the night passed in terrible silence. Morning came with no news, no Carol, no answers. Days turned into a week. The police investigated, but there were no leads, no witnesses, no clues about it happened to Carol Denise Spinks. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air during that short walk to the store. The neighborhood began to buzz with speculation and fear. How could a young girl disappear on a Sunday evening in her own community? Where could she have gone? What could have happened? The answer would come 6 days later, but it would not bring comfort. On May 14, 1971, 6 days after Carol Spinks disappeared, a body was found along Interstate 295 near the Anacostia Freeway. The location was approximately 15 miles from where Carol had last been seen, a desolate stretch of highway embankment covered in grass and weeds. The body was lying face down, partially visible from the road. The victim was Carol Denise Spinks. The discovery devastated her family and shocked the community. The worst fears had been confirmed. Carol hadn't run away. She hadn't gotten lost. Something terrible had happened to her, and now she was gone forever. The condition of Carol's body told a horrifying story. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation from ligature strangulation. Someone had wrapped something around her neck and choked the life out of this 13-year-old girl. The force required, the time it would have taken, the absolute cruelty of watching a child struggle for breath, it was almost impossible to comprehend. But there were other details that would become crucial as the investigation unfolded. Carol's shoes were missing. She had been found without the shoes she'd been wearing when she left home. This wasn't simply a case of shoes falling off during a struggle. They had been deliberately removed and taken. Her body had been carefully positioned, laid out in a specific way that suggested the killer had taken time after her death to arrange her remains. Most disturbing of all, there were green synthetic fibers found on Carol's clothing. Fibers that didn't match anything she had been wearing. Fibers that must have come from contact with her killer or from wherever she had been held. These fibers would become a critical piece of forensic evidence, though at the time, fiber analysis was still a developing science. The medical examiner's report painted a grim picture. Carol had been alive for several days after her abduction. She hadn't been killed immediately. Instead, she had been held somewhere, kept alive while being subjected to repeated sexual assault, before finally being murdered and dumped along the highway like garbage. The thought of what this young girl had endured during those days was unbearable for her family, and for the investigators who had to piece together her final hours. The Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C. began their investigation with the grim determination that comes with a child murder case. Detectives canvassed Carol's neighborhood, interviewing anyone who might have seen something on the evening she disappeared. They talked to store clerks, neighbors, people who had been out on the streets that Sunday evening. They found nothing. No one had seen Carol after she left her home. No one had witnessed an abduction. No one had noticed anything unusual. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the spring air. Investigators examined the 7-Eleven where Carol had been headed, but there was no evidence she had ever arrived. The store clerks didn't remember seeing her. There were no transactions that could be linked to her. Somewhere between her home and that store, during that 7-block walk, Carol had encountered her killer. The location where her body was found offered few clues. Interstate 295 was a busy highway, but the specific embankment where Carol had been left was somewhat secluded. The killer would have needed to pull off the road, carry or drag her body down the slope, and leave it there. This required a vehicle. This required someone who knew the area well enough to find a spot where they could dispose of a body without being immediately seen. Detectives theorized that the killer had a car, that he had somehow convinced or forced Carol into that vehicle, and had then driven away with her. But how? Carol was a sensible girl. She knew not to get into cars with strangers. Had someone she knew approached her? Had someone posed as a figure of authority? Had she been forcibly abducted in broad daylight without anyone noticing? The sexual assault indicated a predator, someone driven by deviant sexual urges. The strangulation suggested someone who wanted control, who wanted to watch his victim die. The removal of the shoes was strange. Was it a trophy? A souvenir? Some kind of ritual or fetish? The careful positioning of the body suggested someone who wasn't panicking, who took timing after the murder to arrange things according to his own dark logic. Forensic experts examined the green fibers found on Carol's clothing. They determined the fibers were synthetic, possibly from a carpet or upholstery. This suggested Carol had been held in a vehicle or a room with this type of carpeting. But in 1971, fiber evidence was difficult to trace, without a suspect to compare the fibers against. They were just another clue in a growing pile of evidence that led nowhere. The investigation expanded to include known sex offenders in the area. Police pulled files on men with histories of sexual assault, particularly those who had targeted young girls. They conducted interviews, checked alibis, and looked for any connection to Carol Spinks or the area where her body was found. Some suspects looked promising initially, but one by one they were eliminated. Alibis checked out, or evidence didn't match, or there was simply no concrete link to the crime. As weeks passed, the investigation began to slow, without witnesses, without physical evidence that pointed to a specific suspect, without any clear motive beyond the obviously sexual nature of the crime. Detectives found themselves chasing shadows. The case remained open, but resources began to be diverted to other pressing matters. Carol Spinks's murder was becoming a cold case. And then, just when it seemed the trail had gone completely cold, another girl disappeared. Darlinia Denise Johnson was 16 years old when she vanished on July 8, 1971, just over 2 months after Carol Spinks's body had been discovered. Darlinia lived in Northeast Washington, D.C., in the Kenilworth neighborhood. Like Carol, Darlinia was an African-American teenager from a working-class family. Like Carol, Darlinia was responsible and trusted by her parents. Darlinia was older than Carol, more mature, more worldly. She had a summer job and was saving money for the future. She was the kind of teenager who balanced work, family responsibilities, and a social life. Her friends described her as fun-loving but sensible, someone who enjoyed going out, but who also knew how to take care of herself. She had street smarts that came from growing up in an urban environment. On that July evening, Darlinia left her home to run an errand. The details were eerily similar to Carol's disappearance. A simple trip, a familiar route, a journey that should have taken no time at all. Darlinia was going to visit her boyfriend who lived nearby. She left home around 8:00 p.m., telling her family she'd be back soon. She never arrived at her boyfriend's house. When Darlinia didn't return home that night, her family was immediately alarmed. They knew about Carol Spinks. Everyone in the African-American communities of Washington, D.C. knew about Carol Spinks. The fear that had been simmering since Carol's murder suddenly came to a boil. Parents who had been nervously watching their daughters, who had been setting earlier curfews and asking more questions about where their children were going, now faced their worst nightmare. Another girl was missing. The police response this time was more immediate. The similarities to the Spinks case were impossible to ignore. Another young African-American girl. Another simple errand in her own neighborhood. Another inexplicable disappearance with no witnesses. Detectives who had worked the Spinks case felt a cold dread settling over them. Was this a coincidence? Or was there a predator actively hunting young girls in Washington, D.C.? For 9 agonizing days, Darlinia's family and the police searched for any trace of her. Volunteers combed the neighborhoods. Police followed up on every tip, every possible sighting. The media began paying attention now with headlines. Quest appearances were connected. On July 19, 1971, the answer came in the worst possible way. Darlinia's body was found along the side of Interstate 295, the same highway where Carol Spinks had been discovered. The location was different, but the similarities were chilling. Like Carol, Darlinia had been sexually assaulted. Like Carol, she had been strangled to death. Like Carol, her shoes were missing. And like Carol, there were those same green synthetic fibers clinging to her clothing. The medical examiner's report confirmed what detectives already suspected. Darlinia had been alive for days after her abduction. She had been held somewhere, subjected to repeated assault, before being murdered and dumped along the highway. The timeline was horrifyingly similar to Carol's case. This was no coincidence. This was the work of the same killer. Washington, D.C. had a serial killer targeting young African-American girls. The Metropolitan Police Department now faced a serial murder investigation. 2 victims. 2 months apart, with strikingly similar patterns. The killer had a clear modus operandi. He targeted young African-American girls, abducted them from their own neighborhoods during simple errands, held them for days while assaulting them, then strangled them and dumped their bodies along Interstate 295. Detectives formed a task force specifically dedicated to these murders. They began the painstaking work of comparing every detail of both cases, looking for any clue that might lead them to the killer. The green fibers found on both victims became a priority. Forensic experts worked to determine their exact composition. trying to narrow down what product they might have come from. The missing shoes from both victims troubled investigators. Why would the killer take the shoes? Some profilers suggested it might be a trophy. Serial killers often took personal items from their victims as souvenirs, objects they could keep to relive their crimes. Others suggested it might have a sexual component, possibly a foot fetish. Still others wondered if it might be practical. Perhaps the shoes could somehow be traced back to the killer, so he removed them to eliminate evidence. The fact that both girls had been held for days before being killed suggested the killer had a location where he could victims without being discovered. This wasn't a crime of opportunity committed in a moment of passion. This was calculated, planned, methodical. The killer had a place, a house, an apartment, maybe a vehicle large enough to serve as a mobile prison, where he could hold these girls while he subjected them to his depravity. The sexual assaults told investigators they were dealing with a sexual predator, someone for whom power and control over young females was a driving compulsion. The strangulation method, ligature strangulation, which requires sustained pressure over time, indicated someone who derived pleasure from the act of killing itself, who wanted to watch his victims die slowly. The choice of dump sites along Interstate 295 was also significant. The killer was using the highway system to dispose of bodies, selecting spots that were accessible by car, but isolated enough that he wouldn't be immediately observed. This suggested someone familiar with the area, someone who knew the roads and understood where bodies might lie undiscovered for days. But perhaps most disturbing was the victimology. Both Carol and Darlenia were young African-American girls from working-class neighborhoods. They weren't runaways or high-risk victims. They were responsible, loved children from stable families. The killer was targeting the most innocent and vulnerable members of the community. The media began calling him the Freeway Phantom, a name that would stick, that would become synonymous with terror in Washington, D.C. The Phantom moved through the city unseen, snatching girls from their neighborhoods, leaving only bodies behind. The summer of 1971 turned into a season of terror for African-American families in Washington, D.C. The knowledge that two young girls had been abducted and murdered in such horrific fashion sent waves of fear through neighborhoods that had once felt safe. Parents who had previously allowed their teenage daughters to walk to the store or visit friends now kept them under constant supervision. Curfews became stricter. Children who had enjoyed the freedom of summer evenings now found themselves locked inside once the sun began to set. Mothers walked their daughters to and from every destination, no matter how close. The sense of community trust that had once defined these neighborhoods was being eroded by the terrifying reality that somewhere among them, or somewhere nearby, a predator was hunting. The police presence increased in predominantly African-American neighborhoods. Patrol cars cruised the streets more frequently. Officers questioned young women about suspicious vehicles or strangers. But despite the increased vigilance, despite the warnings and the fear, the Freeway Phantom was still out there. And he wasn't finished. The task force working the case continued to pursue leads. They interviewed hundreds of people. They looked into every white or light colored vehicle reported in the areas where the girls had disappeared. Witnesses from both abductions had mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars, though descriptions were vague and often contradictory. They investigated men with criminal records, particularly those with histories of sexual offenses against minors. Detectives also began looking into the possibility that the killer might be someone in a position of authority or trust. The ease with which the girls seemed to have been taken suggested they might have gone willingly at first, perhaps with someone they recognized, or someone wearing a uniform, or someone who presented themselves as a figure of authority. In the early 1970s, children were taught to trust police officers, security guards, and other authority figures. Could the killer be exploiting that trust? But every lead seemed to evaporate. Every promising suspect had an alibi or didn't match the profile. Every tip from the public led nowhere. The Freeway Phantom was careful, methodical, and apparently invisible. The African-American community began to express frustration with the investigation. Some activists and community leaders questioned whether the police were devoting enough resources to these cases. Would the response be different if white girls from wealthy neighborhoods were being murdered? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and impossible to definitively answer. The Metropolitan Police Department insisted they were doing everything possible, but the lack of progress spoke louder than their assurances. As summer faded into autumn, there was cautious hope that perhaps the killings had stopped. Maybe the killer had moved away. Maybe he had been arrested for some other crime. Maybe the increased police presence had scared him into stopping. 2 murders, horrific as they were, might be all there would be. That hope was shattered in September. Brenda Faye Crockett was only 10 years old, younger than the previous victims, a child in elementary school who still believed in the fundamental goodness of the world. She lived with her family in Northeast Washington, D.C., not far from where Darlinia Johnson had lived. Brenda was a bright, cheerful little girl with a smile that could light up a room. She loved playing with her friends, loved school, loved the simple pleasures of childhood. She collected dolls and took meticulous care of them, arranging them carefully in her room. She was close with her siblings, always ready to share or help with homework. Her teachers adored her. She was one of those students who made teaching worthwhile, who participated enthusiastically and genuinely cared about learning. Brenda's mother worked hard to provide for her children. Like so many families in their neighborhood, they didn't have much money, but they had love and stability. Brenda understood that her mother sacrificed for the family, and she tried to be helpful to make her mother proud. On September 5, 1971, Brenda was running an errand for a neighbor. This was common in their community. Trusted children would help elderly neighbors with small tasks, maybe picking up groceries or delivering messages. It was a way for kids to earn a little money and for neighbors to help each other. Brenda was responsible enough to be trusted with such errands, and she took pride in being helpful. That Sunday evening, Brenda left to walk to a nearby store. The errand was simple, the route familiar. She was expected back within the hour. But as the minutes turned to hours and Brenda didn't return, her family's concern turned to panic. They knew about Carol Spinks. They knew about Darlinia Johnson. Every parent in the community knew about the freeway phantom. The police were called immediately. This time there was no dismissal of the report as a runaway. Officers responded quickly, knowing the horrifying implications. A 10-year-old girl missing in Northeast D.C. Under circumstances eerily similar to the previous victims, the task force mobilized with grim urgency. But then something unprecedented happened. Something that would both terrify investigators and provide them with their first real insight into the mind of the freeway phantom. Brenda's family received a phone call. 30 p.m. on the evening Brenda disappeared. The phone rang in her family's home. Her mother answered, expecting perhaps a neighbor calling with information about Brenda. Instead, she heard her daughter's voice. It was Brenda. But Brenda sounded strange. Her voice was strained, frightened, almost mechanical. She spoke quickly, as if reading from a script or being forced to say specific words. The conversation was brief and deeply disturbing. Brenda told her mother that she was okay, that she had been kidnapped by a white man in a white car, and that she would be coming home soon. The call lasted only moments before the line went dead. Brenda's mother was simultaneously relieved and terrified. Her daughter was alive, she had just spoken to her. But the circumstances were horrifying. Brenda had been forced to make that call. Someone was making her say those things. And the mention of a white man in a white car gave investigators their first concrete description of the suspect. The police immediately attempted to trace the call, but this was 1971, before the sophisticated phone tracking technology of later decades. The trace was inconclusive. The call had been brief, and the technology simply wasn't advanced enough to pinpoint the location. But why had the killer allowed Brenda to make this call? What was his purpose? Some investigators theorized he was taunting the police, showing off his power and control. Others thought perhaps he was trying to reduce the heat of the investigation. By letting the family know Brenda was alive, maybe he thought they would calm down, that the urgent search might ease off. Some profilers suggested an even darker possibility, that he enjoyed the psychological torture of the family, that allowing them to hear their daughter's voice, knowing they couldn't save her, was part of his perverse pleasure. Whatever his motivation, the call told investigators several crucial things. First, the killer had access to a phone, which meant he was likely holding Brenda in a building, not just a vehicle. Second, he had enough confidence to risk a phone call that could potentially be traced. Third, his description, a white man in a white car, narrowed the profile significantly. The task force immediately shifted their focus. They began looking for white men with access to vehicles, particularly white vehicles, in the areas where the abductions had occurred. They interviewed anyone who matched this basic description. They pulled records on white men with criminal histories in the metropolitan area. But Washington, D.C., and its surrounding areas held thousands of white men who owned vehicles. Even narrowing it down to white vehicles still left an overwhelming number of possibilities. And white man was a broad description. Age, height, build, facial features all remained unknown. The investigation intensified. Detectives worked around the clock. desperately trying to find Brenda before the freeway phantom did to her what he had done to Carol Spinks and Darlenia Johnson. Every hour that passed decreased the likelihood they would find her alive. But they had to try. They had to believe that maybe this time, with this new information, they could save her. For nearly 3 days, the search consumed the Metropolitan Police Department. Volunteers searched vacant lots and abandoned buildings. Patrol officers stopped white vehicles, especially those driven by single white males. Tips poured in from the public, each one investigated, each one leading nowhere, and then, on September 6, 1971, just 1 day after her abduction, Brenda Faye Crockett's body was found. Brenda's body was located at the intersection of 14th Street and Meridian Place in northwest Washington, D.C., unlike the previous victims who had been found along Interstate 295. Brenda had been dumped in a more urban location, along a city street, but she had been left in a trash-filled lot, discarded among garbage as if she were nothing more than refuse. The differences in dump location troubled investigators. Was the killer changing his pattern? Had something disrupted his usual routine? Or had he deliberately chosen a different location for some reason known only to him? But despite the different location, the method of murder was horrifyingly familiar. Brenda had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled to death. And just like Carol and Darlenia before her, her shoes were missing. The same green synthetic fibers were found on her clothing. The timeline was particularly disturbing. Based on the condition of her body and the forensic evidence, investigators determined that Brenda had been killed very shortly after making that phone call to her mother. Perhaps within an hour or two. The killer had allowed her that brief contact with her family, and then he had murdered her. The cruelty of that realization was almost unbearable. Brenda's mother had spoken to her daughter, had heard her voice, had been given a moment of hope that Brenda might come home safely. And all the while, the killer had already decided Brenda's fate. The phone call wasn't mercy, it was torture, both for Brenda and for her family. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Brenda had been sexually assaulted, though the details were kept from the public to spare her family, and to preserve the integrity of the investigation. The cause of death was asphyxiation from ligature strangulation, identical to the previous victims. But there was one crucial difference with Brenda's case: she had been killed much more quickly than Carol or Darlenia. The previous victims had been held for days before being murdered. Brenda had been killed within hours of her abduction. Why? Investigators theorized several possibilities. Perhaps the increased police presence and public awareness after 2 murders had made it too risky for the killer to hold her for long. Perhaps something had spooked him, maybe someone had seen him. Or maybe he feared the phone call could be traced. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, he was evolving, becoming more efficient, shortening the time between abduction and murder. Whatever the reason, the pattern was now undeniable. Washington, D.C. had a serial killer who was targeting young African American girls. 3 victims in less than 6 months. 3 families destroyed. 3 children who would never grow up, never graduate, never fall in love, never live the lives they deserved. The freeway phantom had claimed his 3rd victim, and he had done it with impunity. The murder of 10-year-old Brenda Crockett ignited a firestorm of media attention and public outrage. The previous 2 murders had been covered in the news, but Brenda's age and the horrifying detail of the phone call to her mother captured the public imagination in a more visceral way. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the killings. Television news devoted extensive coverage to the investigation. The freeway phantom became a household name, spoken in hushed, fearful tones. Parents across the city, not just in African American neighborhoods, but everywhere, began to fear for their children's safety. Community meetings were held. Church leaders called for prayer vigils and increased community vigilance. Activists demanded answers from the police department. Why hadn't the killer been caught? What were the police doing to protect young girls? Was enough being done? The Metropolitan Police Department held press conferences, trying to reassure the public while also being honest about the challenges they faced. They released the description from Brenda's phone call, a white man driving a white vehicle, and asked anyone with information to come forward. They emphasized that they were devoting significant resources to the investigation, that they were pursuing every lead. But the reality was that despite their best efforts, the police were no closer to identifying the freeway phantom than they had been after the first murder. The killer was careful, methodical, and left almost no useful evidence behind. The green fibers were consistent across all 3 victims, confirming it was the same killer, but without a suspect to compare them to, they were just another dead end. The FBI became involved, offering profiling assistance and forensic expertise. Federal agents worked alongside local detectives, bringing additional resources and specialized knowledge to the investigation. They developed a psychological profile of the killer based on the known facts of the crimes. The profile suggested they were looking for a white male, likely in his 20s to 40s. He was comfortable in African American neighborhoods and able to move through them without arousing suspicion. He had access to a vehicle and a private space where he could hold victims. He was sexually motivated but also experienced pleasure from the act of killing itself. The strangulation method suggested someone who craved control and dominance. The profile also noted that serial killers typically escalated over time. The crimes became more frequent, more violent, or more risky. The shortened timeline with Brenda Crockett might be the beginning of that escalation. If the pattern held, there would be more victims, and they might come more quickly. This prediction terrified everyone involved in the investigation. How many more girls would die before they caught this monster? The autumn of 1971 was a time of paranoia and fear in Washington, D.C. Parents walked their children everywhere. Schools increased security. Community watch programs formed in neighborhoods across the city. Everyone was looking for the white man in the white car. Though many began to question whether that description was even accurate, it came from a forced phone call made under duress. Could they really trust it? The Metropolitan Police Department received hundreds of tips. Every suspicious white man was reported. Every white vehicle that seemed to be driving slowly through African American neighborhoods was noted. Detectives followed up on each tip, exhausting themselves in the process, but none led to the killer. The task force expanded their investigation to include surrounding areas, Maryland and Virginia suburbs, where the killer might live while hunting in D.C. They looked at employment records for men who worked in or near the neighborhoods where the girls had been abducted. They investigated delivery drivers, utility workers, security guards, anyone whose job might give them legitimate reasons to be in those areas without arousing suspicion. They also looked deeper into the victimology. What connected Carol, Darlenia, and Brenda beyond their race, age, and gender? Were they selected randomly, or was there some pattern the investigators were missing? They mapped out the abduction sites, looking for geographical connections. They examined the girls' schools, social circles, and family connections, searching for any overlap. They found nothing conclusive. The victims seemed to have been selected primarily based on opportunity. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, vulnerable and alone, when the freeway phantom happened to be hunting. This randomness was in some ways more terrifying than if there had been a clear pattern. It meant any young African American girl in Washington, D.C. could be next. It meant there was no way to predict where or when the killer would strike again. As October passed with no new abductions, some people began to hope that maybe the increased scrutiny had driven the killer away. Maybe he had left the area. Maybe he had stopped. 3 murders in 6 months was a horrifying spree. But if it was over, the community could begin to heal. But those closely involved in the investigation knew better. Serial killers didn't just stop. They might pause, might lay low for a while, but the compulsion that drove them to kill always returned. The freeway phantom was still out there, and he would kill again. On November 5, 1971, less than 2 months after Brenda Crockett's murder, 12-year-old Nenemasha Yates disappeared. Nenemasha, who went by Neno to her friends and family, lived in northeast Washington, D.C., in the same general area where several of the previous victims had lived. Neno was a vibrant 12-year-old with a personality that filled every room she entered. She was outgoing, friendly, and had a laugh that was absolutely infectious. She loved music and would dance around her house to whatever was playing on the radio, moving with natural rhythm and joy. Her family treasured her energy and spirit. She was the kind of child who made life brighter just by being present. She was in the 7th grade and enjoyed school, particularly music and art classes where she could express her creativity. She had dreams of becoming a singer someday and would perform for her family, using a hairbrush as a microphone and putting on elaborate shows in their living room. Her mother would smile and applaud, encouraging Neno's dreams while also making sure she kept up with her homework and chores. Neno was responsible and trustworthy. When her mother needed help around the house, Neno stepped up. When errands needed to be run, Neno could be counted on. Despite the fear that had gripped the community since the freeway phantom murders, Bigeno's family had tried to maintain some normalcy. They took precautions, but they couldn't lock their daughter away forever. Life had to go on. On that November evening, Neno went to a 7-Eleven store on Benning Road to buy groceries for her family. It was early evening, still light outside. The store was in a familiar area. It should have been safe, Her mother told her to hurry home, to not talk to strangers, to be careful. Nino promised she will, grabbed the money and headed out. She was seen entering the 7-Eleven by several witnesses. She made her purchases: bread, milk, and a few other items. She was seen leaving the store, carrying her groceries, heading back toward home. And then she vanished. When Nino didn't arrive home within the expected time frame, her mother immediately feared the worst. She called the police without hesitation. The responding officers, now well aware of the freeway phantom cases, treated the report with the utmost seriousness. A 12-year-old African-American girl missing in Northeast D.C., it matched the pattern perfectly. The task force descended on the area. They interviewed the store clerks who had seen Nino, trying to determine if anyone suspicious had been in the store or lurking nearby. They canvassed the rope between the store and Nino's home, asking residents if they had seen anything. They searched for any sign of a struggle, any indication of what had happened. Several witnesses reported seeing a white car in the area around the time Nino disappeared. Some described it as a Chevrolet, though the exact model was unclear. One witness thought they saw a young African-American girl getting into or being placed into a white vehicle, but the details were hazy and the witness wasn't certain. Was this the freeway phantom's white car, or just a coincidence? The investigators couldn't be sure, but it fit with the description from Brenda Crockett's phone call. They put out an alert for white vehicles, particularly Chevrolets, and began stopping and questioning drivers. But once again, the investigation was hampered by the vagueness of the descriptions and the sheer number of white vehicles in the metropolitan area. Finding the right one was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. For days, the search for Nenomashia Yates consumed the Metropolitan Police Department. Her face was on every news broadcast. Her mother made tearful pleas for her safe return. The community rallied, forming search parties, distributing flyers, praying for a miracle. But on November 8, 1971, 1 week after her disappearance, Nino's body was found. Nenomashia Yates was discovered along Pennsylvania Avenue near the Maryland border, not far from some of the previous dump sites. She had been left on the shoulder of the road, partially concealed by vegetation, but still visible enough to be spotted by a passing motorist, who immediately called the police. The scene was devastatingly familiar. Nino had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled to death with a ligature. Her shoes were missing, and the same green synthetic fibers were clinging to her clothing. The medical examiner determined that Nino, like the earlier victims except for Brenda, had been held for several days before being killed. She had been alive for most of the week between her abduction and the discovery of her body. The thought of what she had endured during those days, the fear, the pain, the knowledge that she might never see her family again, was almost too much to bear. The timeline suggested the freeway phantom was returning to his earlier pattern. After the quick murder of Brenda Crockett, possibly driven by the increased police pressure and the risk of the phone call being traced, the killer had apparently felt confident enough to hold Nino for a longer period. This suggested his confidence was growing, that he felt he'd evade capture even with a massive investigation ongoing. The forensic evidence continued to be frustratingly consistent and unhelpful. The green fibers matched those from the previous victims, confirming without doubt that this was the same killer. But fiber analysis in the early 1970s was limited. Without a suspect and a source to compare them to, the fibers were just an evidence waiting for a breakthrough that never came. The removal of shoes from all 4 victims now seemed clearly significant. Some investigators believed it was sexual in nature, possibly indicating a foot fetish. Others thought it might be practical. Perhaps the killer feared the shoes could somehow be traced back to him. Still others saw it as trophy, taking behavior typical of serial killers who kept mementos of their victims. The dump sites showed a pattern of using major roadways, Interstate 295, Pennsylvania Avenue, major streets in D.C. The killer was using the highway system, which made sense. It allowed him to move quickly to access isolated spots and to potentially dispose of bodies outside of his primary hunting grounds. It also made it harder to establish where the killer actually lived or operated from. But one thing was becoming clear: the freeway phantom knew the D.C. area extremely well. He knew which roads to take, where bodies could be left with minimal risk of immediate discovery, how to navigate through different neighborhoods. This suggested someone who either lived in the area or spent significant time there, someone who had intimate familiarity with the geography of the metropolitan region. 4 victims, 4 murders in 7 months, and the Metropolitan Police Department seemed no closer to catching the killer than they had been after the first murder. The pressure on the task force was immense. Community leaders demanded meetings with the police chief. They wanted to know what was being done, why progress was so slow, why their daughters were still in danger. The meetings were tense, emotional, and often contentious. The police tried to explain the challenges, the lack of witnesses, the minimal forensic evidence, the care the killer took to avoid detection. But explanations weren't enough for families who had lost daughters, for parents who lived in constant fear. They wanted results. They wanted the freeway phantom caught and locked away. They wanted to feel safe again. The media coverage intensified. Reporters pressed the police for details about the investigation, about suspects, about any progress being made. The police were caught in a difficult position. They needed public cooperation and tips, but they also couldn't reveal too much about their investigative strategies or evidence without potentially compromising the case. The FBI's behavioral science unit became more deeply involved, offering additional profiling support. They suggested the killer might have a job that allowed flexible hours or significant freedom of movement. He might work nights, or have a job that didn't require him to account for his time carefully. He probably lived alone or had significant privacy in his living situation, given that he needed a place to hold victims for days. The profile also suggested the killer had probably committed other crimes before escalating to murder. Serial killers typically had histories of lesser offenses, maybe voyeurism, burglary, assault, or sexual offenses that hadn't resulted in murder. The task force began looking even more carefully at men with any criminal record, particularly sex offenses in the metropolitan area. They also considered the possibility that the killer might have a connection to law enforcement, or might pose as an authority figure. The relative ease with which he seemed to abduct these girls suggested they might trust him initially, or at least not see him as an immediate threat. A uniformed police, security guard, utility worker might provide that kind of initial trust. This led to uncomfortable internal investigations, looking at whether anyone within the police department or in related professions might be the freeway phantom. The investigations found nothing, but the mere fact that it had to be considered showed how desperate and thorough. As 1971 drew to a close, Washington, D.C. entered the holiday season under a shadow of fear and grief. 4 families would celebrate Christmas without their daughters. 4 empty chairs at dinner tables. 4 stockings that would never be filled. And the terrible knowledge that the freeway phantom was still out there, still hunting, still waiting for his next opportunity to strike. The winter months of late 1971 and early 1972 passed without another abduction. For nearly 4 months, the freedom to have vanished. Some people allowed themselves to hope that the killings had ended. Perhaps the killer had moved to another city. Perhaps he had been arrested for some unrelated crime and was sitting in jail somewhere, his connection to the murders unknown. Perhaps some whispered he had died. But the task force knew better. They had studied serial killers, had consulted with FBI profilers who had experience with these kinds of predators. Serial killers didn't just stop. The compulsion that drove them to kill was too strong, too deeply rooted in their psyche. The freeway phantom was out there somewhere, and he would strike again. The break in the pattern did give investigators time to everything they had accumulated. They went back over witness statements, re-examined forensic evidence, looked for any detail they might have missed. They created detailed timelines for each victim, mapping out their final hours, looking for any commonality beyond the obvious. They noticed certain patterns. All the victims had been abducted while running simple errands, going to stores, visiting friends, doing favors for neighbors. All had been taken during times when they should have been safe, early evenings, familiar neighborhoods, well-traveled roads. All were responsible girls who wouldn't have willingly gone with a stranger. This last point kept coming back to investigators. How was the killer getting these girls into his vehicle? Was he using force? Grabbing them off the street? That seemed unlikely. Such an abduction would draw attention, would have witnesses. Was he using deception, pretending to be someone he wasn't? Was he posing as a figure of authority? Or, and this was a disturbing thought, was he someone the victims knew? Not a family member or close friend. Those had all been thoroughly investigated and cleared, but perhaps someone familiar to the community. A delivery person, a shopkeeper. Someone the girls had seen around enough to not view as a complete stranger. The task force expanded their investigation even further. They looked at every business that operated in the neighborhoods where the girls had been taken. They interviewed delivery drivers, postal workers, meter readers, anyone whose job brought them into regular contact with these communities. They found several people who seemed suspicious or acted nervously during questioning. But in each case, further investigation cleared them. The green fibers remained a tantalizing clue that led nowhere. Forensic experts had determined they were synthetic fibers, possibly from automotive carpeting or upholstery. This suggested the victims had been in contact with the interior of a vehicle, which made sense given the theory that the killer was transporting them to a secondary location. But in the early 1970s, many vehicles used similar synthetic materials. Without a specific vehicle to compare the fibers against, they were just another dead end. The missing shoes continued to puzzle investigators. By now, the killer had taken shoes from 4 victims. Was he keeping them somewhere, creating a collection of trophies? The thought was macabre, but it fit with what profilers knew about serial killers. Many kept souvenirs, items that allowed them to relive their crimes, to maintain a psychological connection to their victims. If the freeway phantom was keeping the shoes, that meant there was evidence somewhere, a collection that could definitively link him to the murders. But where? In his home, in his vehicle, in some storage location. And how would they ever find it without first identifying the killer? As winter gave way to early spring in 1972, the city remained tense. Parents still kept close watch on their daughters. The warnings had been issued after the first murders remained in effect. Don't talk to strangers. Don't get in cars with anyone you don't know. Always tell someone where you're going. Never walk anywhere alone. But as the weeks turned into months without an incident, vigilance naturally began to wane. People couldn't maintain that level of fear indefinitely. Life had to go on. Children had to have some freedom, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the grip of terror began to loosen just slightly. The freeway phantom was waiting for exactly that moment. On November 15, 1972, nearly a full year after the murder of Nenomoshe Yates, the freeway phantom struck again. His 5th victim was 18-year-old Brenda Denise Woodard, making her the oldest victim yet. Brenda Woodard was on the cusp of adulthood. She had recently graduated from high school and was working, saving money, and planning her future. She was a beautiful young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Friends described her as vivacious, intelligent, and full of dreams. She wanted to go to college, maybe study business or education. She talked about traveling, about seeing parts of the world beyond Washington, D.C. Brenda was close with her family. She helped her mother with household expenses, contributed to the family finances from her job, and was a role model for her younger sibling. She showed them that hard work and education could lead to opportunities, that there was a path out of poverty if you were willing to put in the effort. She was also street, smart, and cautious. Brenda was very aware of the freeway phantom murders. She had followed the cases in the news, had heard the warnings. She was careful about where she went and who she associated with. She was old enough, that experienced enough, that she shouldn't have been vulnerable to the same tactics that might work on younger, more naive victims. But on that November evening, Brenda was walking home from her boyfriend's house. She was in southeast Washington, D.C., in a neighborhood she knew well. It was around 1:30 p.m., later than the previous victims had been taken. But Brenda was 18, old enough to be out at night. She was walking along a street she had traveled many times before. Several witnesses later reported seeing a white vehicle, possibly a Chevrolet, driving slowly in the area around the time Brenda disappeared. One witness thought they saw a young African-American woman talking to someone in a white car, but couldn't say for certain if it was Brenda or if the interaction was voluntary or forced. When Brenda didn't arrive home, her family immediately contacted the police. An 18-year-old missing in southeast D.C., the task force responded with the grim knowledge of what this likely meant. The year-long break had ended. The freeway phantom had claimed another victim. The next day, November 16, 1972, less than 24 hours after her disappearance, Brenda Woodard's body was found. Brenda's body was discovered in a wooded area near Maryland Route 22, in Prince George's County, Maryland. This was a departure from the previous dump sites, which had all been within D.C. or very close to its borders. The killer was expanding his territory, possibly feeling that the increased police presence in D.C. made it too risky to dispose of bodies there. The familiar horror awaited the investigators who responded to the scene. Brenda had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled to death. Her shoes were missing. The same green synthetic fibers were present on her clothing. But this time there was something new. Something that would send chills through every investigator who learned of it. There was a note. The note had been placed on Brenda's body, deliberately positioned where it would be found. It was handwritten, the letters formed carefully, the message brief but terrifying in its implications. The exact contents of the note were kept confidential by the police. They didn't want to release details that might inspire copycats or compromise the investigation. But it was clear from the note that the killer was communicating, was reaching out to taunt investigators and demonstrate his control. The presence of the note marked an escalation. The freeway phantom wasn't content to simply kill in silence anymore. He wanted recognition. He wanted to engage with the investigation, to show that he was aware of the efforts to catch him and that he remained beyond their reach. Handwriting experts analyzed the note, trying to determine anything they could about the writer. The handwriting suggested someone educated, someone who could write clearly and coherently. The content of the note, again kept secret by police, suggested someone who followed the news coverage of his crimes, who was aware of what was being said about him. This changed the profile somewhat. The freeway phantom wasn't just a predator acting on impulse. He was someone who paid attention to the investigation, who probably read newspaper accounts of his crimes, who derived satisfaction not just from the killings themselves but from the fear and chaos they created. The FBI profilers suggested that the note indicated the killer was feeling more confident, possibly even invincible. A year had passed without him being caught. 5 victims, 5 successful abductions and murders, and he was still free. That kind of success would embolden a serial killer, make him bolder, more willing to take risks. And the note itself was a risk. Handwriting could be analyzed, could potentially be matched if investigators found a suspect. But the killer didn't seem worried about that. He wanted to communicate, wanted to be heard. The timeline of Brenda's murder was also significant. Unlike Nenomasia Yates and several of the earlier victims who had been held for days, Brenda had been killed within hours of her abduction, similar to what had happened with Brenda Crockett. The medical examiner estimated she had died late on the night of her disappearance, or in the early morning hours of the next day. Why was the killer sometimes holding victims for days and other times killing them quickly? Some investigators theorized it depended on his circumstances. Maybe sometimes he had privacy and time to hold them, other times he felt pressured or at risk and killed them faster. Others suggested the variation might be based on the victims themselves, on how they reacted, on whether they fought or complied. But the presence of the note on Brenda's body suggested a level of planning and deliberation. The killer had taken the time to write a message, to place it on her body, to make a statement. This wasn't a rushed, panicked disposal. This was calculated. The murder of Brenda Woodard and the revelation of the note, though details weren't made public, reignited the panic that had somewhat subsided during the year-long gap between murders. The freeway phantom was back, and he seemed bolder than ever. The media coverage was intense. Headlines screamed about the return of the killer. Television news ran extensive coverage, interviewing community leaders, showing photos of the victims, putting pressure on police to solve the case. The note, though its contents remained secret, became a source of speculation and fear. What had the killer written? Was he threatening more murders? Was he mocking the police? The African-American community, which had borne the brunt of the freeway phantom's reign of terror, erupted in justified anger and fear. 5 young women and girls were dead. 5 families destroyed. And despite years of investigation, despite task forces and FBI involvement and countless hours of police work, the killer remained free. Community activists organized protests and demanded action. They questioned whether the investigation would have been handled differently if the victims were white. They pointed out that serial killers targeting white victims in other cities had been caught more quickly, had received more resources, had generated more urgent responses. The Metropolitan Police Department and the FBI defended their efforts, pointing to the thousands of hours dedicated to the investigation, the hundreds of suspects interviewed, the extensive forensic work. But without results, without an arrest, the defenses rang hollow to grieving families and a terrified community. The task force redoubled their efforts. They went back over everything, looking for any clue they might have missed. They re-interviewed witnesses from previous cases, hoping someone might remember a new detail. They brought in additional handwriting experts to analyze the note left on Brenda Woodard's body. They also expanded their investigation geographically. The killer was now operating in Maryland as well as D.C. This suggested he might live in Maryland, or at least was comfortable operating there. Detectives began coordinating with Prince George's County Police, sharing information, looking for unsolved cases or suspicious activity in areas near where Brenda's body had been found. The white vehicle continued to be a focus. Multiple witnesses across multiple cases had mentioned seeing white cars, usually described as possibly being a Chevrolet. The task force compiled a list of white Chevrolets registered in the D.C., Maryland, and Virginia areas. The list was enormous, containing thousands of vehicles. They began the tedious process of tracking down and interviewing owners of these vehicles, particularly those who were white males in the age range suggested by the profile. Many cooperated fully, allowing their vehicles to be examined, providing alibis for the dates of the murders. Some were nervous or evasive, which drew additional scrutiny, but in each case, further investigation cleared them. The task force also looked at the evolution of the killer's methods. The phone call from Brenda Crockett, the note on Brenda Woodard's body. These were communications, attempts to engage with the investigation or with the public. Serial killers who communicated were often seeking recognition, craving the notoriety that came with their crimes. This suggested the freeway phantom might strike again soon, and might continue to try to communicate. The task force prepared for the possibility of more notes or even phone calls. They set up systems to trace calls more effectively, though the technology was still limited. They prepared statements for how to respond if the killer tried to make contact through media or through the police directly. But as November turned to December, and then into the new year of 1973, no new communications came. No new abductions occurred. The freeway phantom had delivered his message with Brenda Woodard's body in the note, and then had gone silent again. The silence lasted until September 1973. For nearly 10 months, there were no new murders attributed to the freeway phantom. The task force continued their investigation. But without new evidence or leads, they were essentially treading water, waiting for the killer to make a mistake or reveal himself somehow. That mistake never came. Instead, the freeway phantom simply struck again. On September 5, 1973, 17-year-old Diane Denise Williams left her home in the Anacostia neighborhood of Southeast Washington, D.C. Diane was a beautiful young woman, a senior in high school with plans to graduate the following spring. She was intelligent, ambitious, and excited about her future. She talked about going to college, about studying psychology or social work, about helping people. Diane was deeply involved in her church and her community. She volunteered with youth programs, helping younger children with their homework and serving as a positive role model. She sang in the church choir, her voice clear and strong. Friends and family described her as compassionate, mature beyond her years, and committed to making a difference in the world. She was also careful and aware of the dangers that existed in her community. Diane knew about the freeway phantom. Everyone her age knew about those murders. She had promised her mother she would always be careful, would never talk to strangers, would stay alert. On that September evening, Diane was returning home from buying groceries at a store on Nichols Avenue. It was around 6:30 p.m., still light outside, still early enough that she should have been safe. She was seen by multiple witnesses carrying her groceries, walking along her usual road home. And then she disappeared. One witness reported seeing a white car up near where Diane had been walking. The witness thought they saw Diane talking to someone in the car, though they couldn't say whether the conversation seemed friendly or forced. By the time the witness realized something might be wrong and looked back, both Diane and the car were gone. When Diane didn't arrive home, her mother immediately feared the worst. She called the police, and the response was swift. The task force had been on alert, knowing that the freeway phantom could strike at any time. A 17-year-old African-American girl missing in Southeast D.C. Under circumstances that matched the previous victims, they knew what they were dealing with. The next day, September 6, 1983, less than 24 hours after her disappearance, Diane Williams's body was found. Diane's body was discovered on the shoulder of Interstate 295, the same highway where Carol Spinks and Darlenia Johnson had been found more than 2 years earlier. The killer had returned to his original dump site, almost as if completing a circle, closing a chapter. The scene was horrifyingly familiar by now. Diane had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled to death with a ligature. Her shoes were missing. The green synthetic fibers were present on her clothing. But there was something else. Something that made this murder even more chilling. There was another note. Like with Brenda Woodard, a handwritten note had been left with Diane's body. The contents remained confidential, but investigators who saw it reported that it was similar in tone and content to the previous note. The killer was communicating again, making statements, demonstrating his control and his contempt for the investigation. The handwriting matched the note from Brenda Woodard's case. It was definitely the same writer, the same killer. The freeway phantom was making sure there was no doubt about his authorship of these crimes. The timeline again showed a quick kill. Diane had been murdered within hours of her abduction, not held for days like some of the earlier victims. The medical examiner estimated she had died late on the evening of September 5th or early morning on September 6th. The forensic evidence continued to tell the same story as the previous cases. The sexual assault, the strangulation method, the fibers all matched. The killer's signature was clear and consistent. Whoever the freeway phantom was, he had a specific method and he stuck to it. The note added a new dimension to the investigation. Some experts suggested the killer might be trying to justify his actions or explain his motivations. Others thought he might be taunting the police, proving that he could continue killing with impunity. Still others wondered if the notes might contain clues, intentional or unintentional, that could lead to his identification. Handwriting analysts compared the notes to handwriting samples from various suspects who had been investigated over the years. None matched. The killer's handwriting was distinctive enough to potentially identify him if they could find a writing sample to compare against. But without that sample, the notes were just more evidence waiting for a break in the case. The task force was devastated. 6 victims, 6 young lives stolen, 6 families destroyed. And despite everything they had done, despite the thousands of hours of investigation, the killer remained free. Diane Williams would prove to be the last known victim of the freeway phantom. But the investigators didn't know that at the time. They braced for another murder, expecting the pattern to continue. They prepared for a 7th victim and 8th, however many it would take before they finally caught this monster. But the 7th victim never came. After the murder of Diane Williams in September 1973, the freeway phantom seemingly vanished. Weeks passed without another abduction. Then months. Then years. The task force remained active, continued their investigation. But there were no new leads, no new evidence, and most notably, no new victims. This was both a relief and a source of deep frustration. The killing had stopped, which meant no more families would be destroyed, no more young women would have their lives stolen. But it also meant the investigation had essentially stalled. Without new evidence or a new crime to investigate, the task force was left reviewing the same evidence over and over, hoping to spot something they had missed. Why had the killing stopped? This question consumed the investigators and the profilers who had been consulting on the case. Serial killers typically didn't just stop. The compulsion to kill was too strong. They might be forced to stop through arrest, incarceration for another crime, serious illness, or death, but they rarely stopped voluntarily. The most common theory was that the freeway phantom had been arrested or incarcerated for some other crime. Maybe he was sitting in a prison somewhere, serving time for an unrelated offense, unable to continue his killing spree. Task force detectives began looking at men who had been arrested or imprisoned around the time of Diane Williams's murder, trying to find someone whose incarceration timeline matched the cessation of the murders. Another theory was that the killer had died. Perhaps he had been in an accident, had gotten sick, had been killed in some unrelated incident. Without a body or a name, there was no way to confirm this, but it was a possibility. A more disturbing theory was that the killer had simply moved. Maybe the increased scrutiny, the massive investigation, the FBI involvement had made DC too risky. Maybe he had relocated to another city and was continuing his crimes there under a different pattern, creating a new series of victims that wouldn't be immediately connected to the freeway phantom. Some investigators also considered the possibility that the killer had achieved whatever psychological satisfaction he was seeking and had simply stopped. This seemed unlikely based on what profilers knew about serial killers, but it couldn't be entirely ruled out. Maybe the notes, the communication, the recognition had been what he wanted. Maybe having proven he could kill with impunity, he no longer felt the need to continue. Whatever the reason, the freeway phantom had gone silent. The investigation continued, but with decreasing intensity as time passed and resources were needed for other cases. The task force slowly disbanded, though some detectives maintained the case files and continued to investigate when they had time. The case remained officially open, unsolved. 6 young women and girls murdered, and no one had ever been arrested or charged. Throughout the investigation and in the decades since, numerous suspects were considered for the freeway phantom murders. Some seemed promising initially but were ultimately ruled out. Others remained persons of interest, but could never be definitively connected to the crimes. One early suspect was a white man who worked as a police officer in the D.C. area during the time of the murders. This man had access to a vehicle that could have matched witness descriptions, had knowledge of the areas where the victims were taken, and would have been able to use his authority to gain the trust of the victims. He was questioned extensively, but his alibis for several of the murders checked out, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the crimes. Another suspect was a man who had been arrested for attempted abduction of a young African-American girl in Maryland around the same time. as the Freeway Phantom Murders. This man drove a white vehicle and matched some aspects of the profile. However, his handwriting didn't match the notes left with the victims, and he was ultimately cleared through additional investigation. There was also suspicion around a man who had been convicted of sexual assault in the D.C. area and who had attacked victims in a manner somewhat similar to the Freeway Phantom. This suspect was investigated thoroughly, but the timeline of his known crimes didn't align perfectly with all of the Freeway Phantom murders, and again, physical evidence didn't support a connection. In later years, as DNA testing became more sophisticated, investigators hoped that genetic evidence from the crime scenes might finally identify the killer. Some biological evidence had been preserved from the victims, and as DNA technology advanced, it offered the possibility of finally solving these murders. However, the degradation of evident time, the limitations of forensic techniques in the early 1970s, and contamination issues with some samples made DNA analysis challenging. Some testing was conducted, but results were inconclusive or insufficient to generate a usable profile that could be searched in databases. One of the most controversial suspects emerged decades later, a man named Robert Askins. Askins was a Washington, D.C. police officer who was arrested and convicted in 1978 for the kidnapping and murder of 2 young girls in the late 1970s. His crimes bore some similarities to the Freeway Phantom cases. He targeted young African-American girls, he used his position as a police officer to gain trust, and he sexually assaulted his victims. Because Askins was a police officer during the time of the Freeway Phantom murders, because he had access to information about the investigation, and because his later crimes showed he was capable of such violence, some investigators considered him a viable suspect. However, Askins was ultimately ruled out as the Freeway Phantom. His handwriting didn't match the notes, and there were other significant differences between his known crimes and the Freeway Phantom murders. Another person of interest was a military personnel who had been stationed in the D.C. area during the early 1970s, and who later was convicted of sexual assault in another state. This individual matched some aspects of the profile and had experience with vehicles and knowledge of the highway system around D.C. However, like other suspects, he couldn't be definitively linked to the Freeway Phantom crimes through physical evidence. The reality was that without a breakthrough, a confession, a definitive DNA match, or some new piece of evidence, the Freeway Phantom's identity would remain unknown. The case exemplified the limitations of 1970s forensic science and the challenges of catching a careful, methodical killer who left minimal evidence. The 6 families who lost daughters to the Freeway Phantom were left with wounds that would never fully heal. Carol Spinks, Darlenia Johnson, Brenda Crockett, Nenemacia Yates, Brenda Woodard, and Diane Williams, 6 young lives stolen, 6 futures erased, 6 families forever changed by unimaginable grief. For the parents of these girls, the pain was multifaceted. There was the immediate, devastating loss of a beloved child. There was the horror of knowing what their daughters had endured in their final hours, the fear, the violation, the suffering. There was the frustration and anger that the killer had never been caught, never been punished, never been made to answer for what he had done. Carol Spinks's mother struggled to understand how her responsible 13-year-old daughter could vanish during a simple walk to the store. She had sent Carol on that errand, had trusted that the neighborhood was safe, that Carol would be fine. The guilt that came with that decision, irrational though it was, haunted her for the rest of her life. She would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, remembering Carol's smile, her voice, the way she hummed while doing chores. And then the crushing reality would return. Carol was gone, had been gone for decades, and would never come home. Darlenia Johnson's family faced similar torment. Darlenia had been 16, practically an adult, old enough to visit her boyfriend alone. How could they have known that a routine evening would end in horror? Her mother kept Darlenia's room exactly as it had been, unable to bring herself to pack away her daughter's belongings. Clothes still hung in the closet. Books still sat on the shelf. It was as if Darlenia might walk through the door at any moment, though she never would. Brenda Crockett's mother carried an additional burden. She had spoken to Brenda during that terrible phone call, had heard her daughter's frightened voice, and had been powerless to save her. That conversation replayed in her mind endlessly. The strain in Brenda's voice, the forced quality of her words, the knowledge that someone was making her daughter say those things, and then learning that Brenda had been killed so soon after making that call. It was almost too much to bear. The mother of Nenemacia Yates struggled with the knowledge that her vibrant, energetic daughter, full of dreams and music and laughter, had spent her final days in the hands of a monster. Nino had been alive for a week or abduction, held somewhere, subjected to horrors that no parent wants to imagine happening to their child. The thought of Nino's fear, her pain, her desperate hope someone would save her, was a torture that never ended. Brenda Woodard's family felt the particular cruelty of timing. Brenda had been 18, on the verge of true independence and adulthood. She had graduated high school, was working, was planning her future. She had survived the most vulnerable years and seemed safe. And then, just as she was about to spread her wings and truly begin her life, the freeway phantom had taken her. The note left on her body added another layer of violation. The killer had used Brenda's death to send a message, had turned her murder into a communication, reducing her final moments to a twisted statement of his own power. Diane Williams's mother faced the unbearable reality that her daughter was the last known victim. After Diane's murder, the killing had stopped. Did that mean something? Should she take some cold comfort in the fact that no other families had to endure what hers had endured? Or was it just random chance? The questions had no answers, only endless grief. All 6 families shared common experiences. They attended funerals for daughters who should have outlived them by decades. They buried children who should have graduated, married, had children of their own. They faced holidays and birthdays with empty chairs at the table. They watched other families' daughters grow up, achieve their dreams, live the lives their own daughters had been denied. They also shared the frustration of an unsolved case. No arrests,
no justice.
The man who had murdered their daughters walked free somewhere, or perhaps had died without ever being held accountable. Either way, there was no closure, no sense that the world had been made right. Some family members became advocates, pushing for better investigation of crimes against African American victims, demanding that law enforcement take such cases seriously. Others retreated into private grief, unable to engage publicly with the trauma they had experienced. But all of them carried the weight of loss for the rest of their lives. The freeway phantom had stolen more than 6 lives. He had stolen the futures those lives represented, the joy those girls would have brought to the world, the contributions they would have made. He had left behind 6 families broken by grief and 6 communities scarred by fear. The freeway phantom murders fundamentally changed African American communities in Washington, D.C. The sense of safety that had once existed, the belief that children could walk to the store or visit friends without danger, was shattered and never fully recovered. Parents who had grown up in an era where neighborhood children roamed freely, where the community itself provided protection through mutual vigilance and care, now had to impose strict restrictions on their own children. The freedom they had enjoyed growing up was no longer possible for the next generation. The murders also highlighted uncomfortable truths about race and law enforcement in early 1970s America. Many in the African American community felt that the investigation would have been more aggressive, more successful, if the victims had been white girls from wealthy neighborhoods. Whether that perception was fair or not, it reflected a deep-seated distrust of institutions that seemed to value some lives more than others. This distrust created additional barriers for the investigation. Some community members were reluctant to cooperate fully with police, either because they doubted the police's commitment to solving a case, or because of general mistrust of law enforcement. This meant that potential witnesses might not come forward, that information that could have been helpful might not be shared. Community organizations tried to fill the gap. Churches organized safety programs and self-defense classes for young women. Neighborhood watch groups formed, with residents taking turns monitoring streets and reporting suspicious activity. Youth programs emphasized awareness and caution, teaching children to recognize danger and how to respond. But these efforts, while well-intentioned, couldn't fully address the underlying fear. The freeway phantom had demonstrated that even in familiar neighborhoods, even on well-traveled streets, even in the early evening hours, danger could strike. The randomness of his selections, responsible girls running simple errands, made it impossible to feel truly safe. The murders also had economic impacts on the affected neighborhoods. Some families moved away, unable to continue living in areas where their daughters had been taken or where bodies had been found. Property values declined in some areas as the neighborhoods became associated with the murders. Businesses struggled as people became more reluctant to send their children on errands or to shop during evening hours. The media coverage of the murders, intense during the active killing period, and then fading as years passed without resolution, also shaped the community's experience. For a time, these neighborhoods were defined by the freeway phantom, by the terror he had created. And even as decades passed and new generations grew up, the shadow of those murders never completely disappeared. The case became part of the local history, a dark chapter that residents remembered and newcomers eventually learned about. The freeway phantom years became a reference point, a marker of time, a reminder of when their community had been terrorized by an invisible predator. The failure to catch the freeway phantom can be understood in the context of the investigative tools and techniques available in the early 1970s. Modern forensic science, which has solved countless cold cases through DNA analysis and other advanced technologies, simply didn't exist in the way we know it today. In 1973, when the murders occurred, DNA profiling had not yet been developed. That breakthrough wouldn't come until the 1980s, more than a decade after Freeway Phantom's last known murder. This meant that biological evidence from the crime scenes, which might have definitively identified the killer if collected and preserved properly, could not be fully analyzed using the techniques available at the time. The green synthetic fibers found on all the victims were a good example of the limitations. Investigators knew these fibers were significant, knew they likely came from the killer's vehicle or a location where victims were held. But fiber analysis in the early 1970s could determine general composition and type, not specific origin. Without a suspect vehicle to compare them against, the fibers were just another piece of evidence waiting for a breakthrough. Fingerprint technology existed and was used, but the victims' bodies and the locations where they were found didn't yield clear fingerprints from the killer. Either he wore gloves or environmental conditions degraded any prints he might have left, or he was simply careful not to leave them. The handwriting analysis of the notes left with Brenda Woodard and Diane Williams could potentially have identified the killer if investigators had a sample to compare against. But without a suspect, handwriting analysis was limited to developing a general profile of the writer, educated, careful, deliberate, without being able to point to a specific individual. Surveillance technology was also primitive compared to modern standards. There were no widespread security cameras in the early 1970s, no traffic cameras at intersections, no doorbell cameras or smartphone videos. The eyewitness accounts of white vehicles in the areas where victims disappeared were all investigators had, and eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, especially when witnesses are trying to remember details they didn't realize were significant at the time. The lack of centralized databases was another major limitation. In the 1970s, there was no national DNA database, no computerized fingerprint matching system, no way to quickly cross-reference suspects across different jurisdictions. If the freeway phantom had committed crimes in other states before or after the D.C. murders, there was no easy way to connect those cases. Even within D.C., record-keeping was largely paper-based. Detectives maintained files in filing cabinets, shared information through phone calls and in-person meetings, coordinated with other agencies through formal letters and reports. The kind of instant information sharing that modern investigators take for granted simply wasn't possible. The investigation also suffered from resource limitations. The Metropolitan Police Department was dealing with numerous serious crimes simultaneously. While the Freeway Phantom Task Force received significant resources, they couldn't dedicate unlimited personnel to the case indefinitely. As years passed without new leads, some detectives had to reassign to other pressing cases. The geographical scope of the investigation created additional challenges. The killer operated in D.C., Maryland, and potentially Virginia. This meant coordinating across multiple police jurisdictions, each with their own protocols and priorities. While there was cooperation, the lack of a unified command structure sometimes created inefficiencies. Additionally, the profile of the victims, young African American girls from working-class neighborhoods, may have affected resource allocation, consciously or unconsciously. This was an era when institutional racism was more overt, when the value placed on black lives was demonstrably less than that placed on white lives in many parts of American society. Whether this directly impacted the investigation is impossible to definitively prove, but the question has been raised by community members and some researchers. The Freeway Phantom was also simply careful and methodical. He selected victims opportunistically but killed methodically. He left minimal evidence at crime scenes. He chose dump locations that didn't provide obvious clues to where he lived or operated from. He apparently didn't tell anyone about his crimes. No bragging to friends. No confessions to family members that might have eventually led to his identification. All of these factors combined to create a perfect storm of investigative challenges. A careful killer operating during an era of limited forensic technology, targeting victims from a community that had complicated relationships with law enforcement, and then mysteriously stopping before making the mistake that might have led to his capture. Over the decades since the last Freeway Phantom murder, investigators, profilers, journalists, and amateur sleuths have developed numerous theories about the killer's identity. While none have been proven, they offer insight into the various possibilities that have been considered. The police officer theory has been one of the most persistent. This theory suggests the killer was a law enforcement officer, someone posing as one. Several factors support this theory. First, the victims seem to have been taken without obvious struggle or witnesses to a violent abduction, suggesting they may have trusted, or at least not feared their abductor initially. A police uniform would provide that instant trust, especially in an era when children were taught to always obey and trust police officers. Second, the killer seemed to have detailed knowledge of the investigation. The notes left with later victims suggested someone who was following the case closely, who understood what the police were doing and perhaps what they weren't doing. A police officer would have access to that information, would know which areas were being heavily patrolled and which weren't. Third, the killer operated successfully across multiple jurisdictions and seemed comfortable using the highway system to transport victims and dispose of bodies. A police officer would have this knowledge and comfort level, would understand how different jurisdictions operated and where the gaps in coverage might be. The case of Robert Askins, the D.C. police officer who was later convicted of murdering 2 young African-American girls, gave this theory additional weight. While Askins was ultimately ruled out as the Freeway Phantom, his case demonstrated that the theory wasn't far-fetched. There was precedent for a D.C. police officer being a sexual predator and murderer of African-American girls. However, the police officer theory has significant problems. Extensive background checks were done on officers who matched the general profile. Alibis were checked for the dates of the murders. Handwriting samples were obtained and compared to the notes. None yielded a match. While it's possible the killer was an officer who somehow evaded this scrutiny, it seems unlikely given the thoroughness of the internal investigation. Another theory suggests the killer was someone with a delivery or service job that took him regularly into the neighborhoods where victims were abducted. A postal worker, utility company employee, delivery driver, or similar professional would have legitimate reasons to be in these areas, would be seen regularly enough to not arouse suspicion, and would have opportunities to observe potential victims and identify vulnerable targets. This theory explains how the killer could operate in different neighborhoods without standing out. Someone in a uniform or driving a recognizable company vehicle would blend into the scenery of daily neighborhood life. Residents might even know them by sight without knowing their name, creating a false sense of familiarity. Investigators did look into people in these professions, but again, the number of potential suspects was enormous, and without physical evidence linking any specific individual to the crimes, they couldn't narrow the field. A third theory proposes that the killer was a military personnel stationed in the area. The early 1970s saw significant military presence around Washington, D.C. Military personnel had access to vehicles, often had housing that provided privacy, and their transient nature meant they could come and go from the area without raising questions. The discipline and methodical nature of the crimes could reflect military training. The ability to control victims, to avoid leaving evidence, to plan and execute abductions, these could all be skills enhanced by military experience. And if the killer was transferred out of the area or deployed overseas, that could explain why the murders stopped. However, military investigators cooperated with the task force, and no military personnel could be definitively linked to the crimes. Service records were checked, but without a specific suspect. The search was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Some researchers have proposed that the Freeway Phantom might have been a serial killer who was active in other locations before or after the D.C. murders. Perhaps he was traveling through the area, or lived there temporarily, and the murders were part of a larger pattern of crimes committed across multiple states. The sudden start and stop of the killing spree in D.C. would make sense if the killer was mobile. This theory is difficult to prove or disprove without identifying the killer first. Researchers have looked for similar unsolved cases from the same time period in other locations, murders of young African American girls with similar characteristics, but no definitive connections have been established. There's also a theory that the Freeway Phantom died or was incarcerated for unrelated crimes shortly after the last murder. This would explain why the killing stopped so abruptly. Investigators have looked at men who died or were imprisoned around 1903-1974, trying to find someone who matches the profile and whose timeline aligns with the cessation of the murders. Some suspects have been identified through this method, men who were violent offenders, who had access to vehicles, who were in the area during the murders, and then died or were imprisoned shortly after, or without physical evidence linking them to the freeway phantom crimes. These remain unproven theories. A darker theory suggests there might have been more than one killer, that some or all of the murders attributed to the freeway phantom might actually have been committed by different people. The similarities in the crimes could be explained by copycat killers who were aware of the earlier murders and deliberately mimicked the methods. This theory is generally considered unlikely. The consistency of the forensic evidence, particularly the green fibers found on all victims and the matching handwriting on the notes, strongly suggests a single killer. While it's possible some unrelated crimes were incorrectly attributed to the freeway phantom, the 6 cases discussed here almost certainly represent the work of one individual. Finally, there's the frustrating possibility that the freeway phantom was investigated at some point, was perhaps even interviewed by detectives, but was cleared based on the limited evidence and techniques available at the time. He might have provided an alibi that couldn't be disproven, or the handwriting comparison was inconclusive, or he simply didn't seem like a strong enough suspect to warrant further investigation. This happens more often than people realize. Serial killers sometimes slip through investigative nets, especially in the era before DNA testing. They're questioned, evaluated, and dismissed, and only later, sometimes decades later, is their guilt established through new evidence or techniques. If this is what happened with the freeway phantom, then his name might be sitting somewhere in the case files, one among hundreds of suspects who were considered and cleared. With modern technology, some of those old suspects could potentially be re-evaluated, their DNA compared to evidence from the crimes if such evidence still exists in usable condition. Despite decades passing since the last known freeway phantom murder, the case has never been officially closed. The Metropolitan Police Department maintains the files, and periodically, detectives review the case with fresh eyes or when new forensic techniques become available. In the 1990s, as DNA analysis became more sophisticated, there was hope that genetic evidence from the crime scenes could finally identify the killer. Some biological evidence had been preserved from the victims, though the quality varied. Forensic scientists attempted to extract and analyze DNA, but the degradation of samples over time and limitations in the technology of the era when evidence was collected made results inconclusive. Some partial profiles were obtained, but they were incomplete, not sufficient to definitively identify a suspect, or to compare against DNA databases with high confidence. The hope remained that as DNA technology continued to advance, these partial profiles might become more useful. In the 2000s, into advances in genealogical DNA testing, the same techniques that eventually identified the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes offered new hope for solving the freeway phantom case. This method uses DNA from crime scenes to identify possible relatives of the perpetrator through public genealogical databases, then works backward to identify the specific individual. However, this technique requires quality DNA samples to work effectively. If the preserved evidence from the freeway phantom cases is too degraded or contaminated, genealogical DNA might not be viable. Additionally, the technique works best when the perpetrator or close relatives have submitted their DNA to genealogical databases, which may or may not be the case here. The Metropolitan Police Department has indicated they remain committed to solving these murders if possible. Cold case detectives periodically review the files, looking for new leads or witnesses who might have information they didn't share decades ago. Sometimes people who were afraid to speak in the 1970s, or who didn't think what they knew was important, come forward years later. There have also been renewed efforts to engage with the community, particularly older residents who might remember details from the time of the murders. Memory is imperfect, especially over decades, but sometimes seemingly small details can provide new investigative directions. Media attention has periodically revived interest in the case. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime books have examined the freeway phantom murders, bringing them to new audiences and sometimes generating new tips. While most tips don't lead anywhere, it only takes one good piece of information to break a cold case. Some family members of the victims have remained vocal advocates for justice, keeping the cases in the public eye and putting pressure on law enforcement to continue pursuing leads. They've participated in media interviews, spoken at community events, and lobbied for resources to be dedicated to solving these decades-old crimes. The case has also been studied by criminal justice researchers and profilers as an example of the challenges of investigating serial murders, particularly in an era before modern forensic techniques. Academic papers have been written analyzing the freeway phantom's methods, the investigation's strengths and weaknesses, and what lessons can be learned for current investigations. The freeway phantom case shares similarities with other notorious serial killer cases, though each has unique elements. Understanding these comparisons helps illustrate what made the freeway phantom both typical and unusual among serial murderers. The case perhaps most frequently compared to the freeway phantom is that of the Atlanta child murders of 1979-1981. Like the freeway phantom, the Atlanta killer targeted young African Americans, in that case primarily boys and young men, though some girls were also victims. Like the freeway phantom, the Atlanta killer created terror in African American communities and raised questions about whether law enforcement was doing enough to protect black children. The Atlanta case eventually led to the arrest and conviction of Wayne Williams, though controversy remains about whether Williams was responsible for all the murders attributed to him. The key difference is that the Atlanta case was solved, or at least officially closed with an arrest, while the freeway phantom case remains open. Another comparison is to the Oakland County child killer, who murdered at least 4 children in Michigan in 1976-1977. That case also remains unsolved, and like the freeway phantom, it involved a killer who seemed to hold victims for a period before killing them, who was methodical and careful, and who then mysteriously stopped. The Oakland County case also has generated ongoing investigation and periodic renewed interest as new forensic techniques become available. The Zodiac killer case offers parallels in terms of the killer's communications. Both the Zodiac and the freeway phantom sent messages, though the Zodiac was far more prolific in his communications, sending numerous letters to newspapers and police. Both seemed to derive satisfaction from the attention and fear they generated, and both cases remain officially unsolved, though recent developments in the Zodiac case using genealogical DNA have generated hope for a resolution. The original Night Stalker Golden State Killer case demonstrates how cold cases can be solved decades later through advances in DNA technology. Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in 2018 for murders committed in the 1970s and 1980s, identified through genealogical DNA techniques. This case offers hope that similar methods might eventually identify the freeway phantom, though success depends on the quality of preserved evidence and other factors. What makes the freeway phantom case somewhat unusual is the abrupt cessation of the murders after Diane Williams. Many serial killers continue until they're caught killed or physically unable to continue. The freeway phantom's sudden stop after 6 victims is less common, though not unprecedented. It raises questions that may never be answered about what happened to cause the killing to end. The case is also notable for the consistency of the killer's methods across all 6 victims. Some serial killers evolve their techniques over time, becoming more violent or changing their approach. The freeway phantom maintained a remarkably consistent pattern: young African American females, abducted during simple errands, sexually assaulted, strangled, dumped along roadways, shoes removed. This consistency helped investigators confirm they were dealing with a single killer, but also revealed little about his identity or psychology beyond his basic predatory nature. In recent years, advances in forensic technology have brought renewed hope to the families of the freeway phantom victims and to the investigators who never forgot these unsolved murders. The techniques that didn't exist in the 1970s, sophisticated DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, digital databases, and computer-assisted investigation, now offer possibilities that seemed like science fiction when Carol Spinks first disappeared in 1971. The Metropolitan Police Department has maintained the evidence from these cases, storing it carefully in the hope that someday, technology would advance enough to extract useful information. Some biological samples from the victims have been preserved, though their condition varies. The challenge with evidence this old is degradation. DNA breaks down over time, especially if not stored under optimal conditions. But even degraded DNA can sometimes yield results with modern extraction and amplification techniques. In 2019, the Washington, D.C. police announced they were re-examining the freeway phantom case using modern forensic methods. This announcement came in the wake of several high-profile cold case solutions using genetic genealogy, most notably the Golden State Killer case. The technique involves uploading DNA profiles from crime scenes to public genealogical databases, identifying potential relatives of the perpetrator, and then using traditional detective work to narrow down suspects. The process is complex and not always successful. It requires high-quality DNA samples, relatives of the perpetrator who have submitted their DNA to public databases, and extensive follow-up investigation. For a case as old as the Freeway Phantom murders, there are additional challenges. The killer would now be in his 70s or 80s at minimum, possibly deceased. His relatives might not have used genealogical testing services, or the preserved evidence might not yield sufficient DNA for comparison. Nevertheless, investigators have expressed cautious optimism. Even partial results could provide new investigative directions. If they could narrow the suspect pool to a particular family line or geographical area, that information combined with the historical investigation records might point towards specific individuals who could be further investigated. The police have also utilized modern database technology to re-examine the hundreds of suspects who were interviewed during the original investigation. In the 1970s, tracking and cross-referencing this information was done manually, using paper files and human memory. Now, sophisticated computer systems can identify patterns, connections, and inconsistencies that might have been missed decades ago. Some of these historical suspects have been reinvestigated using modern techniques. Where possible, investigators had obtained DNA samples, sometimes from living individuals, sometimes from deceased persons through preserved biological material or from relatives. Each comparison takes time and resources, but the process continues. The involvement of podcasters, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts has also brought fresh attention to the case. While amateur investigators sometimes complicate police work, they can also generate new leads by interviewing people who might not think to contact police, by examining the case from different angles, or simply by keeping public attention focused on these unsolved murders. Several podcasts have done extensive episodes on a Freeway Phantom, interviewing family members, former investigators, and experts. These programs have reached audiences who weren't alive when the murders occurred, creating a new generation aware of these crimes and potentially motivating someone with information to come forward. Books have been written examining the case in detail, analyzing the investigation, profiling the likely killer, and advocating for continued efforts to solve these murders. These works serve both to educate the public and to maintain pressure on law enforcement to dedicate resources to cold cases. Social media has become another tool in modern cold case investigation. Photographs of the victims, information about the case, and appeals for information can reach millions of people instantly. Someone who was young in the 1970s, who saw something but didn't understand its significance, might now be in their 60s or 70s and could be reached through these platforms. The challenge remains that without a definitive break, a DNA match, a credible confession, or new physical evidence, the case remains circumstantial and speculative. But investigators continue to work, families continue to hope, and technology continues to advance. Despite decades of investigation and countless hours dedicated to understanding these crimes, fundamental questions about the Freeway Phantom remain unanswered. Who was he? The most basic question has no answer. Was he a police officer, a military personnel, a delivery driver, or someone in another profession entirely? Did he live in D.C., Maryland, or Virginia? Was he married, single, living alone, or hiding his crimes from people close to him? These questions define the mystery at the heart of the case. Why did he stop? Serial killers rarely cease their activities voluntarily. The abrupt end to the murders after Diane Williams in September 1973 demands explanation. Did he die? Was he imprisoned for another crime? Did he move to another location? Or did something psychological shift within him that ended his compulsion to kill? What was the significance of the shoes? All 6 victims had their shoes removed and taken. This consistent detail across all murders suggests it was important to the killer, but why? Was it sexual, practical, symbolic, or some combination? The shoes were never recovered, never found in any suspect's possession. Where are they now? What did the notes say? The contents of the handwritten notes left with Brenda Woodard and Diane Williams have never been publicly released. What message was the Freeway Phantom trying to send? Was he taunting police, trying to explain himself, or communicating something else entirely? The secrecy around the notes protects the investigation but also fuels speculation. Were there other victims? 6 murders are attributed to the Freeway Phantom, but could there be more? Might he have killed before Carol Spinks or after Diane Williams in other locations using different methods? Or were there victims in D.C. whose cases weren't connected to the freeway phantom pattern but were actually his work? Why these specific victims? While all were young African American females from working-class neighborhoods, was there something else that connected them? Did the killer select them randomly based solely on opportunity? Or was there some pattern investigators missed? Did he know them even peripherally, or were they complete strangers? Could he have been caught, looking back with modern knowledge? Were there moments when the investigation came close to identifying the killer, but missed the crucial connection? Was he interviewed and cleared based on insufficient evidence? Did someone know his identity but never came forward? These questions may never be answered. The passage of time makes resolution with each passing year. Witnesses die, memories fade, evidence degrades, and the killer himself, if not already dead, ages and potentially takes his secrets to the grave. Yet the questions persist because the families deserve answers, because justice demands accountability, and because 6 young lives were stolen and their killer never faced consequences. The unanswered questions represent not just an investigative failure, but a moral imperative that remains unfulfilled. The freeway phantom murders left an indelible mark on Washington, D.C. that extends far beyond the 6 families directly affected. The case represents a turning point in how communities think about safety, how parents protect their children, and how law enforcement approaches serial murder investigations. For the African American community in D.C., the murders highlighted systemic issues that persist today. The question of whether these cases received adequate resources and attention because the victims were young black girls from working-class neighborhoods remains a painful topic of discussion. While the Metropolitan Police Department dedicated significant resources to the investigation, the lack of resolution has fueled ongoing conversations about equity in law enforcement and whose lives are valued in America. The case also influenced how police departments handle serial murder investigations. The task force approach used in the Freeway Phantom case, bringing together detectives from different units, coordinating with FBI profilers, centralizing information, became a model for future investigations. The lessons learned, both successes and failures, inform protocols that are still used today. The murders changed parenting and affected neighborhoods for generations. Parents who lived through the Freeway Phantom era passed their fears and caution to their children, who passed them to their children. The sense that danger could strike anywhere, at any time, during the most routine activities, became embedded in the collective consciousness of these communities. Children who grew up in D.C. during the 1970s remember the fear. They remember the strict curfews, the constant warnings, the way their parents' faces would change when the news mentioned another body found. They remember being walked to school, even when they were old enough to go alone. Remember having their independence curtailed because somewhere out there, the freeway phantom was hunting. That generation grew up faster than they should have. They learned that the world could be cruel, that evil was real, that bad things happened to good people for no reason at all. They learned to be vigilant, to trust no one completely, to always be aware of their surroundings. These were lessons learned in fear, lessons that shaped how they raised their own children decades later. The impact rippled outward beyond just the African American community. The Freeway Phantom became a cautionary tale for all of Washington, D.C. Parents across the city, regardless of race or neighborhood, became more protective, more fearful. The murders demonstrated that random violence could strike anyone, that predators existed who viewed human beings as nothing more than prey. Yet alongside the fear and grief, there is also resilience and hope. The families of the victims, despite their unimaginable loss, have often channeled their pain into advocacy. They've worked to ensure their daughters are remembered not just as victims, but as real people with dreams, talents, and futures that were stolen. They've pushed for continued investigation and for justice that may still come, even decades later. Community organizations that formed in response to the murders continue to work on youth safety, education, and empowerment. The tragedy sparked initiatives that have helped countless young people in the years since, creating positive change from horrific circumstances. self-defense classes, community watch programs, youth mentorship initiatives, all born from the determination that the Freeway Phantom's legacy would not solely be one of fear. Churches in the affected neighborhoods became centers of healing and support. Prayer vigils held in the 1970s for the victims became annual remembrances. The spiritual community provided comfort when the justice system could not provide closure. Faith became a refuge for families who needed to believe even if earthly justice failed, there would be divine accountability, and the investigation continues. Cold cases are never truly closed while there remains even the smallest possibility of resolution. Detectives still review the files, new technologies are still applied to old evidence, and the hope persists that someday, somehow, the Freeway Phantom will be identified and the families will finally have answers. Recent years have brought renewed commitment from law enforcement. The Metropolitan Police Department has publicly stated that solving the Freeway Phantom case remains a priority. New cold case units have been formed, with detectives dedicated specifically to reviewing unsolved murders from decades past. Modern forensic technology is being applied to preserved evidence, and genealogical DNA techniques offer possibilities that didn't exist even 10 years ago. The families cling to this hope. Some of them are elderly now, having spent the majority of their lives waiting for answers. They know time is running out, that they may not live to see justice served. But they continue to hope, continue to advocate, continue to demand that their daughters not be forgotten. It is crucial to remember that behind the statistics, the forensic evidence, and the investigative theories were 6 real people whose lives mattered, who were loved, and who are missed. Carol Denise Spinks was 13 years old, a responsible daughter who helped her family, who dreamed of a better future through education. She had a gentle demeanor and warm brown eyes. She hummed while doing chores. She was someone's beloved daughter, someone's cherished sister. She should have lived to graduate high school, to pursue those dreams, to become the woman she was meant to be. Instead, her life ended on a highway embankment, stolen by a predator who saw her only as prey. Darlenia Denise Johnson was 16, working a summer job and saving for her future, fun-loving but sensible. She balanced responsibility with the normal desires of a teenage girl. She wanted to see her boyfriend, wanted to hang out with friends, wanted to enjoy her youth. She was trusted by her parents because she had earned that trust. She should have had the chance to finish growing up, to discover who she would become as an adult, to live out the future she was working toward. Brenda Faye Crockett was only 10, a bright child who loved her dolls and made her teachers proud. She had an infectious enthusiasm for learning and a smile that could light up a room. She was helpful, eager to please, proud when adults trusted her with errands or responsibilities. She should have had years of childhood ahead of her, years to play and learn and grow, years to slowly mature into the teenager, and then the woman she would have become. Nena Moshe Yates was 12, full of energy and music, with an infectious laugh and dreams of singing. She would dance around her house, perform for her family, fill their lives with joy and sound. She had personality that couldn't be contained, spirit that made life brighter for everyone around her. She should have had the opportunity to share her talents with the world, to see if those dreams of becoming a singer could come true, to find out what else she might achieve. Brenda Denise Wooder was 18, on the verge of independence, planning for college and a career helping others. She had made it through the most vulnerable years. She had graduated high school, was working, was contributing to her family while planning her future. She was street smart and cautious, aware of the dangers but determined to live her life. She had worked so hard to reach that point, and should have been allowed to begin the life she'd been building toward. Diane Denise Williams was 17, involved in her church and community, preparing to graduate high school and make a difference in the world. She volunteered with youth programs, sang in the choir, was a role model for younger children. She was compassionate and mature, someone who genuinely wanted to help others and make her community better. She should have had that chance. She should have been able to pursue psychology or social work, to fulfill that calling to serve 6 futures, 6 individuals who deserved so much more than they got. The Freeway Phantom took their lives. but he could not erase who they were or diminish the impact they had on those who loved them. Their families keep their memories alive, through photographs yellowed with age, through stories told and retold, through the simple act of never forgetting. These young women and girls were more than victims of an unsolved serial killer. They were daughters, sisters, friends, students, dreamers. They had favorite songs and favorite foods. They had inside jokes with their friends and special bonds with their siblings. They had quirks and habits that made them uniquely themselves. They mattered. They still matter, and they will continue to matter as long as are people who remember them, who speak their names, who refuse to let them be reduced to mere statistics in an unsolved case file. As we close this chapter on the Freeway Phantom, we must acknowledge that the story isn't truly over. Somewhere, the answers exist. Whether the killer is alive or dead, whether evidence still exists that could identify him, whether someone out there knows something they've never shared, the possibility of resolution, however remote, remains. The families of Carol, Darlinia, Brenda, Nenomashia, Brenda, and Diane deserve justice. They deserve to know who stole their daughters and why. They deserve the closure that comes with answers, even if those answers cannot undo the damage or bring their loved ones back. The community deserves to know that these crimes mattered, that these lives were valued enough that the pursuit of justice never ceased. And perhaps most importantly, the victims themselves deserve to be remembered not just as the casualties of an unsolved serial killer case, but as the real individual people they were. The Freeway Phantom created fear and pain that echo through decades. But he did not win. The families persevered. The investigation continues. And the memories of 6 young women and girls live on, cherished by those who loved them and honored by those who refused to let their cases be forgotten. How could someone do this? How could someone prey on children and teenagers, inflict such horror, and then vanish into the shadows? The world still struggles to understand this level of cruelty. This case reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, that monsters sometimes walk among us undetected, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's just justice that hasn't arrived yet. The Freeway Phantom may have escaped accountability in the 1970s, but the search for truth continues. Technology advances, memories surface, evidence is re-examined, and perhaps someday, the Phantom will finally be exposed to the light. Until then, we remember, we honor the victims, we support the families, and we refuse to let these cases fade into obscurity. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Good night, and stay